As my mother got older, the filter between her brain and her mouth became increasingly porous. We had always been a family that kept secrets. If anyone had ever done anything that was even slightly embarrassing, it was forbidden to ever mention it. And I don't want to sound like Prince Harry writing a tell-all narrative about my own mother, especially 20 years after she's been dead, but as my mom got older, an entire lifetime of stored skeletons in the closet started to come out, most of which I never wanted to know. I didn't want to know that my favorite uncle had gotten his cousin's wife pregnant. I didn't want to know that the uncle who stayed on the family farm and I was around all the time at one point had gotten drunk and made a pass at my mother after she had been married to my father for years. But the stories just would come out of context, out of the clear blue, and land on the living room carpet the same way you might look at a cat having recently thrown up on your carpet. It was about that welcome. But her penchant for telling truths that no one asked her about got personal on the Christmas visit my then wife and I paid to them in 1988 when we told them that we were going to be adopting a baby girl from Korea. My wife and I were arguing about the name we were going to give our daughter. Most female names were on the rejection list for my ex, who had been a school teacher for several years, and most girls' names had an unpleasant association with a student that she disliked from past years. In fact, as it turned out, she had evidently never had a Valerie in class, and that became the only name that we could seriously consider. I can only hope that this is not a common trait among school teachers, but I'm not going to chase that rabbit into the psychological brush. As my mother overheard us discussing names, she just volunteered that when I was born, she and my father were so depressed that they were having another baby that they had not even been able to discuss what name that they would give to me. She said that Dr. Starr walked into her hospital room and said, "I'm ready to dismiss you, but I can't do it until you give this baby a name so I can fill out the birth certificate." So she said, they just gave me the first name that came to mind. And I said, the only thing that you could say at a time like that, "Merry Christmas to you too, Mom." It honestly wasn't a big deal. I have advanced degrees in counseling and I understand family dynamics pretty well. And I'd known for a long time that I wasn't especially a wanted child. In fact, I'd known that I wasn't their first unwanted child. They had a boy and a girl in the 1940s, and that was the family they meant to have. And then there were two accidents in the 1950s, born only because abortion wasn't legal in the United States at that time. And ironically, that brother and I are both decidedly pro-choice, in spite of what that might mean to our existence. I don't let this awareness haunt me. I'm pretty well convinced that if you took all of the unwanted pregnancies out of the world, there wouldn't be enough people left to have a civilization or even bother to pave roads. Only those of us who are parents by adoption can raise children who can be absolutely certain that they were wanted because we wrote the checks and filled out the forms. Still, for the past 45 years, it's been a little bit of a handicap for me as a pastor when Mother's Day rolls around, and there is an expectation that I'm going to deliver some solipsistic saccharine sermon in praise of mothers. Not that they don't deserve it. I just don't have that kind of material in my experience to fall back on, at least not in a biological hallmark sort of way. My supervisors in my counseling grad school program often tried to hammer me about that classic Freudian issue of why my mother didn't love me. But it never got much traction with me because, as it turns out, my life has been adorned by wonderful mother figures who loved me very much. Many, if not most of these women, never had children of their own, but they had a lot of love to give, and they helped to give me a very full life. Most of us had school teachers that we would even slip up now and then and call mom. My third grade teacher was a very large woman who never married, but who gave her entire life to other people's children. She was not just my third grade teacher, she was also my Sunday school teacher, and later she became my high school youth group sponsor. You'd think that spending Monday through Friday in a crowded classroom with 35 8-year-olds would be enough for anyone. But Beulah, and that was her real name, had boundless affection to give to children, though I never felt like I was her favorite, or even that she had favorites. She didn't let it show. But I don't think that there was any name of a boy or a girl that she would have stricken off of a potential list because she seemed to care about all of us. She did choose me to be the preacher on Youth Sunday when I was a senior in high school, allowing me to deliver my first sermon at the age of 17. I don't know that I was the best choice out of my high school youth group. I strongly suspect that I may have just needed to have been chosen at that time. I remember hearing an interview with a mother of 7 children who was asked how she managed to love all of her children the same. And she said, "Oh, I never loved them all the same. I gave the most love to the one who, at that time, needed it the most." I think a childless woman like Miss Grooms, who had contact with at least 60 kids a week, every week, was wise enough to give time and attention to the one who might not be getting it anywhere else, the ones who needed to be put, as I did, in the spotlight for a minute to receive an extra word of encouragement or praise or sense of self-worth. I suspect that I am not alone in having had wise, childless mothers in my life. You probably did too, and they made your childhood much better than it might have been without them. I think the public schools are full of them. Not all teachers. I don't want to be Pollyannish about this. Some of my teachers were simple-minded to the point of being almost illiterate. More than one was, I think, fair to say, a bit sadistic back in the days when being able to beat other people's children was sort of one of the job benefits for underpaid and frustrated teachers. But there were saints who walked among them, mentors for whom we owe a debt of gratitude for how they helped us along. I can think of several. I've looked back at my high school annuals where my former teachers wrote notes to me when I was graduating, and I have to admit, as an adult, I've been shocked to see how poorly they could spell and how corrupt their grammar was. But that was life in rural Kentucky. In the hillbilly land of Kentucky, we kind of had our own language. It bore some slight resemblance to English. We understood each other, but my professors in graduate school were not very impressed. Vanderbilt is in Tennessee, so you would think that the professors would recognize the educational deficits of their 20-something students who had grown up in what almost could have been a foreign country had it not been just 50 or 60 miles away. They mostly corrected us through humiliation, which is, I suspect, why so many of my classmates dropped out in the first year of seminary. But I had the extreme good fortune of having an elderly widow in my student church, Ms. Mimi Lamb, who was a retired professor of elocution from a women's college. She had married a young doctor after the Great War, but they never had children. And I think I was Miss Mimi's favorite. Every Sunday after church, when I would have delivered my enthusiastic grad school student sermon to my county seat congregation, Mimi would wait in the back until I'd shaken hands and greeted everyone at the door, And then I would see her back in the corner, motioning me into a classroom for a private conversation. Her technique of teaching grammar was the opposite of my famous professor's public humiliation. Miss Mimi would say to me softly in her deep Southern accent, "Now, Raja, you're almost perfect. I just want to help you to be perfect." And then would come a brief lesson about subject-object agreement or the proper placement of adjectives in a sentence. And over the 5 years of my graduate school and doctoral studies, Mimi taught me to speak English. My early grad school papers came back to me with red marks all over them and exasperated remarks from professors who clearly did not believe that I deserved to be there. My last paper, my doctoral dissertation, was turned in after years of being tutored by Mrs. Lamb. And if you've ever been through that meat grinder, that is the process of earning a doctoral degree, you know that you have a committee of professors who read your dissertation, one at a time. And they write notes to each other on a separate sheet of paper that they stick into the dissertation when they pass it to the next committee member and the next. By accident, the chair of my committee returned my copy of the dissertation to me without removing those notes. And one of my professors had written, "I regard this work to be a modern miracle. I never would have dreamed that this student could do this level of work." I didn't have the humility or the self-awareness at the time to tell Don Beiswinger that credit was due to Miss Mimi Lamb. When I showed up at Vanderbilt, I wasn't capable of doing that kind of work. And what made the difference to me over the next few years was, I'm convinced, the undeserved affection and time and attention of a childless mother who believed that she could help me. And she found a way to do it that didn't have to make me feel inferior or to make herself seem to be just too smart to tolerate my native hillbilly language. Mimi should get a credit in every book that I've published and every lecture I've delivered to international audiences, because she is the reason that I got to that point in my life. You may not be horribly impressed with who I've become, but trust me, you wouldn't have liked who I was before some of those childless women in my life decided that, deserving or not, they were going to give me their affection. I suspect that if you allow yourselves to think about it, you could come up with your own list of saints. It may not have been a childless mother. It could have been your grandmother. It could have been an aunt, maybe a neighbor, someone you knew from church, or even a librarian who just noticed that you always checked out the thickest books on the shelf, who realized that you had potential that your parents and your siblings could never see. I don't say these things today to take away from mothers who do richly deserve our praise, and every handmade card and bunch of hand-picked flowers lovingly drawn from the lawn, but all of us didn't have that mom. And not all of us had women in our lives who had children no matter how much they desperately wanted to. Mother's Day isn't a walk in the park for everyone, but many of us were mentored, encouraged, loved, reassured, I can say healed, by women with whom we shared no DNA at all. And I cannot say enough in praise of those women, nor can I say enough to encourage everyone who hears these words to do everything you can to give a hand to someone who just isn't going to reach their potential without your help. Previous generations typically grew up within a rooted extended family, so that there were grandparents and aunts and uncles and cousins and farmhands, all of whom took part in the training and education of every child. But I didn't have that. My daughter didn't have any of that. The world is different now. Families are smaller, and even if you've got relatives, most of them live far away. In spite of all of our fear of being misunderstood or accused of having improper motives, there are children and young adults around you who have empty places in their heart that you could fill. I'm 66 years old, and I just lost a childless mother who has, even through the fog of Alzheimer's, still been both a friend and a mother to me. And I'll tell you, I'll spend the rest of my life being grateful for her. I don't blame my parents for not being better at being parents. God knows they were better at it than their parents were. But I want to ask for all of us to pause for a moment to be grateful for the people who had a little extra love to give, especially when we needed it the most, and to be inspired by that awareness to run the risk of loving someone that you did not give birth to, but who may need you in very profound ways. Don't spend your whole life just trying to get ahead, to promote your own well-being, to feather your own nest, or to garner praise to your name. Pause for a moment to look around and see who just might be able to do more than you ever will, go farther than you ever will, be more accomplished than you ever will be, who just needs someone to believe in them and to be taught that irregardless isn't a word, that they really mean irrespective. And you didn't give a gift to Valerie and I, you gave a gift to Valerie and me, because sometimes it really is the little things.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.